Sterling Maddox woke up to 100 ghosts, not the shimmering, see-through kind you hear about in campfire tales. These were ghosts of flesh and blood, 100 warriors standing dead silent in the pre-dawn gloom, their horses like statues behind them. They'd surrounded his small cabin on the forgotten edge of the territory, appearing from nowhere, making no sound. Their faces were painted, and not for war. This was something else, something older, colder. It was ceremony. Sterling's hand, gnarled and scarred from a lifetime of hard ranching, didn't even think about reaching for the rifle over the mantel. He was 73 years old, and he knew a losing fight when he saw one. More than that, he knew these weren't the kind of men you fought with lead. They weren't here to kill him. They were here for something much, much worse. He'd been waiting for this day for 23 years, ever since the winter that stole everything from him. He just never thought they'd come like this, in perfect, silent formation. An army of judgment waiting for one old man to step outside. Through the grime on his window, he saw their leader, a woman. Her hair was black as a crow's wing, with streaks of pure silver that caught the first hint of morning light. Her eyes were locked on his front door, and they burned with an intensity that could melt steel. In her hands, she held a bundle wrapped in old deerskin, and when Sterling saw what was peeking out from the corner of that bundle, his heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone decades ago, squeezed so hard it felt like his ribs would crack. A small piece of faded blue fabric. He knew that color. He knew that dress. The world outside his window held its breath. Not a horse stamped its foot. Not a warrior shifted his weight. The sun climbed, casting long, accusing shadows across the yard. And still, they waited. It was time. The debt he'd been running from his whole life had finally come to collect. The question was, could he possibly pay it? Because the last time he'd tried to do the right thing, it cost him his wife. It cost him his daughter. And it cost him his soul. Sterling's bare feet hit the cold wood floor, and every joint screamed in protest. Pain was an old friend. He ignored it and limped to the window, pressing his weathered face against the cool glass for a closer look. The formation was perfect, a flawless circle of silent judgment. Each warrior stood exactly 10 paces from the next, their expressions unreadable, their stillness absolute. It was a display of discipline that would have made a general weep. He focused on the woman again, Ayanna. He'd known it was her, of course, but seeing her now, it was like looking at a memory brought to life. The starving, half-frozen child he'd carried through a blizzard was gone. In her place stood a leader who commanded 100 men with just her presence. The bundle in her hands seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Inside, it was the proof of his greatest failure. The reason he'd locked himself away from the world for 23 years, speaking to no one, trusting no one. A young warrior in the back, maybe no older than 18, shifted his moccasins in the dust. It was a tiny movement, almost nothing, but Ayanna heard it, or felt it. She turned her head just a fraction of an inch and looked at him. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The young man froze solid, his face a mask of shame. The message was clear. There would be no mistakes today. This ceremony would be perfect. Sterling fumbled with the buttons on his old shirt, his fingers shaking not from age, but from the weight of what was coming. 23 years of silence. 23 years of believing he deserved this lonely, empty life. He'd run to the edge of the world to escape his past, and his past had just shown up on his doorstep with an army. He walked over to his small kitchen table. A cold cup of coffee sat there, untouched. Beside it lay a letter he'd been writing for months, rewriting every single day. A letter he never planned to send. It was his confession, his apology, the whole story of the choice he made that had burned his entire world to the ground. Outside, the sun was higher now. The heat was starting to build. But the warriors didn't move. Their vigil was absolute. Sterling knew he had a choice. He could stay inside, bolt the door, and wait. They were a peaceful people. They wouldn't burn him out. They would just wait, days, weeks, until he faced them. Or he could open the door. He could walk out there and face the truth he'd been running from since that God-forsaken blizzard in the winter of 1851. The light caught the bundle in Ayanna's hands again. That little patch of blue, Emma's dress, the one she was wearing the day she died, the day he chose to save an entire tribe instead of his own little girl. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He stopped. He couldn't do it. The memory crashed over him, not like a wave, but like a mountain of ice and snow, bearing him all over again. December 1851, the blizzard that never ended. 8 days of white hell. He saw Ayanna as a girl again, barely 12. Her lips were cracked and blue, her body on fire with a fever that was boiling her alive. He'd found her half buried in a snowdrift, her horse frozen solid just a few feet away. And beyond her, scattered across the frozen valley, were the bodies. 47 of them. Men, women, children, her people, dying. He'd been on his way home. His saddlebags were full of medicine from town. Quinine for fevers, tonics for the lungs, thick blankets. Christmas was 3 days away. He'd promised his daughter, his little Emma, that he'd be home to hang the stockings she'd sewn herself. Instead, he found himself standing at a crossroads created by God or the devil. Go home to his own sick wife and daughter, or stay and save the 47 souls dying right in front of him? He made a choice, and it was the wrong one. Through the window, Ayanna's breath made small white clouds in the cool morning air. She hadn't flinched, hadn't moved a muscle. This wasn't a threat. This was something else. A ritual. They were paying him respect. But respect for what? For the man who saved their ancestors? Or for the man who let his own family die? Sterling stumbled over to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed. The hinges groaned as he lifted the heavy lid. A cloud of dust motes danced in the single beam of sunlight slicing through the cabin. There it was, tucked beneath an old wool blanket, a yellowed newspaper clipping. He'd read it 1,000 times until the words were burned onto the back of his eyes. The headline was brutal. Local rancher's family perishes while he aids hostile tribe. Hostile? That's what the paper called them. The same people standing outside his door, their weapons sheathed, their faces calm and ceremonial. The article had painted him as a monster, a traitor to his own kind, a man who abandoned his Christian wife and child to play hero for savages. The town had turned on him overnight. His friends crossed the street to avoid him. His ranch hands quit without a word. The bank called in every loan he had. He'd lost everything in less than a month. But there was one thing the newspaper never knew. One secret he'd guarded his whole life. Sterling Maddox hadn't just stumbled upon those dying people in the snow. He'd been looking for them. He'd been tracking them for 2 days. Because his daughter, his sweet little Emma, she wasn't just his daughter. She was half Cheyenne. She was Ayanna's cousin, and the tribe dying in that valley. They were her mother's people. They were her family. A hawk screamed high overhead, its cry cutting through the suffocating silence. A few of the warriors glanced up, their eyes following its lazy circles in the sky, but their bodies remained locked in position. Sterling squeezed his eyes shut. It was time to stop running. He had to face it, all of it. He forced himself to remember every detail of those 8 days, every frozen gasp of air, every life that slipped through his fingers, every life he managed to pull back from the brink. He'd found Ayanna first. She was delirious, muttering in Cheyenne, a language Sterling understood. His beloved wife, Little Dove, had taught him before she died, giving birth to Emma. She'd made him learn the words, the stories, the names of her family. Beyond Ayanna lay the rest of her band. 47 people scattered like frozen dolls. Some were already gone, their faces peaceful under a blanket of snow. Others were still breathing, their chests rattling with disease. They were too weak to build a fire, too sick to travel. He made his camp right there. He used his supplies, the supplies meant for his own family, to build crude shelters. He was no doctor, but his father had been, and he'd learned enough to know what to do. He brewed willow bark tea for the fevers. He made hot broth for the starving children. He used the new blankets he'd bought for Emma and his wife, Sarah, to wrap the shivering elders. For 3 days he didn't sleep. He moved from person to person, a phantom in the swirling snow, feeding them, tending to their frostbite, whispering words of encouragement in the broken Cheyenne he remembered. Every life he saved felt like a victory. But on the 4th day, the storm got worse. The temperature plummeted. The wind howled like a demon. The elders started to fade. That's when he made the decision that sealed his fate. He took off his own thick winter coat, the best one he owned, and wrapped it around a small boy whose breathing had become shallow. He gave his last personal blanket to an old woman whose cough was so violent he thought her ribs would break. He shared the last of his personal food, a small bag of jerky and hardtack, with three young mothers whose own milk had dried up. By the sixth day, he was as weak as his patience. The cold had sunk deep into his bones. His hands were numb claws. He could barely think straight, but he saw Emma's face in the faces of the children. He saw his beloved little dove in the stoic expressions of the women. These weren't strangers. This was family, and he had made a promise to his wife on her deathbed, a sacred promise. If my people ever need you, Sterling, you will be there for them. You will be their brother. He looked out the window again, at Ayanna, the fierce, strong leader, not the dying girl. The bundle in her hands was his entire life. Everything he'd gained and everything he'd lost, all wrapped up in a piece of deerskin. He'd thought he'd lost everything that day, but looking at Ayanna, at the 100 warriors standing behind her, a strange thought flickered in his mind for the first time in 23 years. What if he hadn't lost? What if he'd just been too blind with grief to see what he'd won? On the 8th day, the sky cleared. The blizzard broke. The sun came out, glittering on a world of white. He had saved 31 people. 16 had been lost. The cold had taken them, but 31 lived. They were weak, but they would make it. They were strong enough to get to the main reservation, where food and shelter were waiting. Ayanna survived. Her fever had broken on the 5th day. She looked at him with eyes that held a universe of gratitude. As they prepared to leave, the tribal elder, Ayanna's father, pressed something into Sterling's hand. It was a small medallion, carved from bone, depicting a mother bear standing over her cubs. "For the man who chose our children over himself," the old man whispered in broken English, "this debt will not be forgotten." Sterling had pocketed the medallion and started for home. He was exhausted, frostbitten, and starving, but his heart was full. He had kept his promise to Little Dove. Sarah and Emma would be so proud. They would understand. But when he finally crested the last hill and saw his ranch, there was only silence. No smoke from the chimney, no horses in the corral. A terrible, heavy stillness hung in the air. He spurred his horse, his heart pounding with a dread so cold it made the blizzard feel warm. He threw open the door to his home and stepped into a nightmare. Sarah was in their bed. She looked like she was sleeping, but her skin was the color of ice. The doctor later called it pneumonia. The same brutal cold that had trapped the tribe had settled in her lungs. She'd been waiting for him, waiting for the medicine he was carrying, the medicine he had given away. He found Emma in the kitchen. She was curled up by the fireplace, wrapped in every quilt and blanket in the house. The fire had gone out days ago. She had tried to take care of her mother, a little girl all alone trying to fight a monster. She was wearing the blue dress, the one she'd been so excited to wear for Christmas morning, the dress that was now in Ayanna's hands. He buried them both himself in the frozen ground behind the house. His heart was as hard and cold as the dirt. The town found out, of course. The story spread like wildfire. Sterling Maddox, the man who let his family freeze to death while he was out playing savior to a band of hostiles. Traitor, monster, fool. And now, 23 years later, the debt had come due. Was this an execution, forgiveness, or something else entirely? He had to know. Sterling's hand, steady now, closed around the cold iron of the door handle. He took one last look around the dusty cabin, the prison he'd built for himself. He pulled the door open and stepped out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. The world shifted. It was like a switch had been thrown. 100 heads snapped in his direction. 100 pairs of eyes locked onto him. The focus was so intense it felt like a physical force, pushing him back. But there was no anger in their eyes, no hatred. It was reverence. Ayanna took a single, deliberate step forward, then another. She moved with the grace of a mountain cat, each step placed with ceremonial precision. She stopped 10 feet in front of him, close enough now that he could see the fine lines etched around her eyes, the proud set of her jaw. She was her father's daughter, a leader through and through. "Sterling Maddox," she said. Her voice was strong and clear, carrying across the silent yard. Her English was perfect. The man who gave everything. Sterling's throat felt like it was full of sand. He could only manage a hoarse whisper. "Ayanna, you, you grew strong." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Because you made sure I lived long enough to grow." Behind her, the warriors stood like a wall of silent witnesses. This was a trial. He was sure of it. "Why now?" Sterling asked, his voice cracking. "After all this time, why?" Ayanna lifted the deerskin bundle. "Because yesterday I buried my father." She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out something that glinted in the sun. It was a bone medallion, a mother bear protecting her cubs, an exact copy of the one in Sterling's pocket. "With his last breath," she continued, her voice thick with emotion, "he made me promise. He said the debt must be honored. The story must be told. The truth must be spoken." Sterling felt his legs start to tremble. The old elder, the only other person who knew the whole truth of that week. He was gone. "Before he died," Ayanna said, her gaze unwavering, "he told me what you whispered to him when you thought I was too deep in the fever to hear." Sterling's mind reeled. What had he said? In his exhaustion, in his delirium, what secrets had he let slip? Ayanna's voice dropped, becoming softer, more intimate. "You told him you weren't just saving strangers, you were saving your daughter's family. You told him that Emma's mother, your little dove, had made you promise." The word struck him like a physical blow. The promise. He had forgotten ever speaking of it aloud. He'd buried it so deep under layers of guilt and grief that he'd forgotten it himself. "You kept your promise to a dead woman," Ayanna said, her voice ringing with a fierce pride. "And in keeping it, you lost everything you had left in the world." Tears, hot and sharp. Tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in 23 years burned his eyes. Ayanna took another step forward. "But that's not the only reason we are here, Sterling Maddox. My father told me something else. A secret he kept for all these years." Sterling stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. A secret? What other secret could there be? "He told me why your wife and daughter really died." The world stopped spinning. The air turned to glass. Sterling could only stare, speechless. He knew why they died. He was the reason they died. Pneumonia, lack of medicine, his failure. It was simple, brutal, true. "No," Ayanna said, as if reading his thoughts. "That is the story you were told, the story you believed. It is not the truth." From behind her, a young warrior stepped forward. His face was hard, his eyes burning with an old anger. It was Kale, the one who had shifted his feet earlier. "My grandfather was one of the men you saved, old man," Kyle said, his voice laced with a strange mix of respect and resentment. "He told us the stories, but he left one part out, a part the elder only told his daughter on his deathbed." Ayanna held up her hand, silencing the young warrior. She looked back at Sterling, her expression grim. "Your wife was a strong woman. The sickness took hold, yes, but she was fighting it. The town doctor said she could have survived if she'd had the medicine." "I know," Sterling croaked. "The medicine I gave to you." "No," Ayanna repeated, her voice sharp as flint. "The medicine was in the town, at the general store, enough to save a dozen families. But when your wife sent a neighbor boy to fetch it, the store owner refused to sell it to him." Sterling's blood ran cold. "What? Why? Tom Morrison was my friend." "Tom Morrison," Ayanna said, her voice dripping with contempt, "had just been paid a great deal of money. By another man. A man who wanted your ranch. A man who wanted your water rights. A man who knew that if your family died while you were away, the town would turn on you, and he could pick up your land for pennies on the dollar." A wave of dizziness washed over Sterling. This couldn't be true. It was a nightmare. "Who?" he whispered. "Who would do such a thing?" Ayanna looked past Sterling, her gaze fixing on something over his shoulder. A cloud of dust was rising in the distance. More riders were coming. "He is coming now," Ayanna said, her voice like the tolling of a funeral bell. "We sent word an hour ago. We told him the Cheyenne had come to pass judgment on Sterling Maddox. We knew he wouldn't be able to resist watching you fall. Sterling turned slowly. Dozens of riders were approaching, the townsfolk, and at their head, riding a fine black horse, was a man Sterling recognized instantly. A man who had been the first to call him a traitor. The man who had personally foreclosed on his ranch. Mayor Ricks. The air crackled with a tension Sterling had never known. The circle of warriors stood their ground, a silent army of witnesses. The townsfolk reined in their horses, forming a confused outer ring, and in the middle stood one old man, his entire life being rewritten in a matter of minutes. Mayor Ricks trotted his horse forward, a smug look on his face. Well, well, Maddox. Looks like your chickens have finally come home to roost. Causing trouble with the natives again, are we? He looked at Ayanna, his eyes filled with disdain. Whatever this man owes you, I assure you, the town will not pay for his mistakes. Ayanna didn't even flinch. She simply unwrapped the deerskin bundle completely, and inside it wasn't just Emma's blue dress. There was something else, a small, leather-bound book. We know what you did, Mayor Ricks, Ayanna said, her voice carrying to every person in the yard. Ricks laughed, a short, ugly sound. You know nothing. This is Sarah Maddox's journal, Ayanna announced, holding the book high. My father found it in the snow near the house weeks after the funeral. He could not read the words, but he knew it was important. He kept it safe. For this day. Ricks's face went pale. She wrote about you, Ayanna continued, her voice a relentless accusation. She wrote about your visit, how you offered her medicine, how you held the cure for her sickness in your hands. A gasp went through the crowd of townspeople. But you did not offer it out of kindness. Ayanna's voice rose, filled with righteous fury. You made her a deal, the medicine, in exchange for the deed to this land, for the water rights to the river. Rick started to bluster. That's a lie, a fabrication from a bitter old man. Is it? Ayanna asked. She opened the journal. Tucked inside was a folded piece of paper, a receipt. Sarah Maddox writes that you told her there was no other medicine to be had, that you had bought it all. This receipt, from Tom Morrison's general store, dated the day before you visited her, shows you purchasing the entire winter's supply of pneumonia tonic. Silence. A deep, profound, damning silence. Every eye, warrior and townsman alike, was now fixed on Mayor Ricks. His smug mask had crumbled, replaced by the slack-jawed panic of a cornered rat. Tom Morrison, the store owner, pushed his horse forward, his face ashen. He told me it was for a sickness in his own family, he stammered. I swear to God, Sterling, I never knew. The truth was out. A lie 23 years old had just been slaughtered in the morning sun. Sterling looked at his hands. For 2 decades, he had believed these hands had failed his family. He had carried the guilt of their deaths every single day. He had built a prison of grief and locked himself inside it. But he wasn't the monster. His choice hadn't killed them. Greed had killed them. Evil had killed them. Mayor Ricks had murdered them. The weight of 23 years lifted from Sterling's shoulders. It was a physical sensation, so powerful he nearly collapsed. He wasn't a failure. He was a victim. And then a new feeling replaced the grief. Cold, hard rage. You, Sterling said, his voice low and dangerous, a rusty growl he hadn't used in decades. He took a step toward Ricks. You let them die. Ricks, seeing the look in Sterling's eyes, yanked on his reins, trying to turn his horse. But it was too late. The young warrior, Kyle, moved like a lightning strike. He launched himself forward, grabbing the bridle of Ricks's horse, holding it fast. 2 other warriors moved to block any escape. Ricks was trapped. Now hold on, Ricks sputtered, his eyes darting around for help. This is a matter for the law. You can't just listen to the word of my mother? A voice boomed. Everyone turned. A man was pushing his way through the crowd of warriors. He was older, his face a mask of solemn duty. He wore the badge of a U.S. Marshal. He stopped beside Ayanna. I am Marshal Kane. My mother was one of the 31 people Sterling Maddox saved in that blizzard. Ayanna sent for me weeks ago. She told me what her father suspected. We've been waiting for the right moment. The Marshal looked at Ricks, his eyes like chips of ice. Mayor Ricks, you are under arrest for the murders of Sarah and Emma Maddox. The story wasn't over. Not even close. Because as the marshal cuffed a sputtering Rex, Ayanna turned back to Sterling. Her expression was still grim. This was the first part of the debt, she said softly. To give you back your name. To give you justice. Sterling's mind was reeling. The first part? But now, she said, her eyes pleading, now we must ask you to honor your promise one more time. A cold dread trickled back into Sterling's veins. What is it? What's wrong? Kyle, the young warrior, stepped forward again. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by a desperate fear. It's happening again, Sterling Maddox. The sickness. Sterling stared at him, confused. What sickness? It started a month ago, Ayanna explained, her voice tight with worry. A fever, a cough that rattles the bones. It starts with the children. We've already lost 3. Our medicine man is trying everything, but it's no use. It's the same sickness that nearly killed me in the snow. The warriors behind her murmured their agreement. Their stoic, ceremonial faces were now filled with a raw, terrifying anxiety. This wasn't just a ceremony to honor a past debt. It was a desperate plea for help. Our healers say it is a curse, Cal said, his voice shaking. They say that by saving our people, you interfered with the spirits. And now the spirits have come back to claim the lives they were owed. Wayna shot him a sharp look. Others believe you are the only one who knows how to fight it, that you were sent to us once before and have been sent again. Sterling looked at the faces of the 100 warriors, at the fear in the eyes of the townsfolk, at the shaking hands of the U.S. Marshal holding a murderer in chains. His life had been a straight, lonely road for 23 years. Now in the span of a single hour, that road had twisted into a dozen different paths. He was no longer a hermit, he was a witness, a victim, and now they wanted him to be a savior all over again. He looked at Sarah's journal in Ayanna's hands. He thought about the medicine, the pneumonia tonic. Ricks hadn't just murdered his family, he'd hoarded the cure. A thought sparked in his mind, a terrible, chilling connection. Ayanna, he said, his voice urgent. The sickness. Where did it start? Which families were hit first? Ayanna looked confused. It started in the downstream camps, the families who live closest to the river. The river that runs through this property, Sterling finished, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. He turned and looked, not at the people, but at the land itself. His land. The land Ricks had tried to steal. The land with the best water rights in the territory. After I lost the ranch, Sterling said, thinking aloud. Ricks bought it. What did he do with it? Tom Morrison, the store owner, spoke up, his voice trembling. He rerouted the main creek, Sterling, dammed it up to create a private reservoir for his cattle, left the old riverbed downstream mostly dry, and it all clicked into place. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't a spiritual debt. It was Ricks again. It had always been Ricks. It's the water, Sterling said, his voice ringing with certainty. When he dammed the creek, the water downstream became stagnant. It's poison. He didn't just murder my family 23 years ago. He's murdering your people right now. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of revelation. The collective, gut-wrenching understanding of a truth so vile, it was almost impossible to comprehend. One man's greed was a poison that had flowed through time, killing anyone who stood in his way. Ayanna looked from Sterling to the cuffed mayor, her face a storm of fury and grief. He did this to us? Again. Before anyone could react, Cale let out a roar of pure rage. He drew a long knife from his belt and lunged toward Hiyix. I will send you to the spirits myself. The U.S. Marshal was fast. He shoved Hyrix behind him, drawing his own pistol and leveling it at Cale. Stand down, son. The law will handle this. The warriors tensed. Several of them reached for their own weapons. The townsfolk backed their horses away, their eyes wide with fear. The fragile peace was about to shatter into 100 pieces of bloody violence. This was the real test, the real choice. No! Sterling's voice boomed across the yard with an authority he hadn't known he possessed. Everyone froze. They all turned to look at the old man. Sterling walked calmly between the marshal's gun and Kell's knife. He looked the furious young warrior directly in the eyes. "Revenge is a fire that warms you for a moment, but leaves you in ashes," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Your people don't need his death. They need a cure. They need clean water." He then turned to the marshal. "And your law moves too slow. My people," and he was surprised to hear himself say the words, "my people are dying right now. Justice can wait. Life cannot." He looked at the crowd, at the warriors, the townsfolk, the lawman, the murderer. They were all waiting for him, waiting for Sterling Maddox to tell them what to do. 23 years ago, he'd made a choice in a blizzard that defined his life. Now he had to make another. He took a deep breath. The air no longer felt heavy with the past. It felt fresh, full of purpose. "Tom," he said, looking at the store owner, "gather every man with a strong back and a shovel. We're going to break that dam." He turned to Ayana. "Get your people ready. We need to move everyone in the downstream camps to fresh water immediately. We'll set up a new camp here, on high ground." He looked at the marshal. "Marshal, you can have your prisoner. But first he's going to tell us exactly what he put in that water, and if there's any medicine in this town that can fight it." It was a whirlwind of activity. The townspeople, their faces etched with a deep, collective shame, went to work with a fervor Sterling had never seen. Led by Tom Morrison, they grabbed shovels, picks, and axes and marched toward the illegal dam Hicks had built. They were no longer shunning a traitor. They were following a leader. The warriors, under Ayana's calm and efficient command, began the grim task of evacuating the sick. They worked with a quiet urgency, their movements precise and coordinated. The fear was still in their eyes, but now it was tempered with something new: hope. Sterling, meanwhile, felt a fire in his veins he thought had been extinguished decades ago. The knowledge his father had passed down to him, long dormant memories of herbs, poultices, and treatments, came rushing back. He turned the main room of his dusty cabin into a makeshift infirmary. He directed the healthier women to gather willow bark for the fevers and yarrow for the infections. He showed them how to brew the teas, how to clean the sick beds, how to make the suffering comfortable. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was the son of a doctor. He was the husband of a Cheyenne woman. He was both worlds, and for the first time in his life, he understood that this was not a contradiction. It was his strength. The marshal got his confession. Hicks, broken and defeated, admitted everything. He hadn't actively poisoned the water, but he had known the dam would cause sickness downstream. He'd seen it as a way to weaken the tribe, to make them move off their land so he could claim even more territory. It was a slow, passive, cowardly kind of murder. He also admitted that there was a new kind of tonic at the doctor's office in town. A stronger one he had made sure to keep for himself and his family, just in case. Within the hour, a rider was dispatched. By late afternoon, the dam was broken. A great cheer went up from the townspeople as the fresh, clean water of the creek surged back into its natural channel, washing away the stagnant poison that had plagued the riverbed. It was a symbolic cleansing, a washing away of an old sin. The sick, especially the children, were brought to Sterling's ranch. He worked tirelessly, moving from one pallet to the next, his old hands surprisingly steady as he administered the newly arrived medicine. As he wiped feverish brows, as he spoke soft words of comfort in the Cheyenne language he thought he had forgotten. Ayana worked beside him, her respect for him growing with every life he touched. She saw not an old broken man, but the hero her father had always described. Kyle, the young warrior, stood guard at the door. His knife remained sheathed. He watched Sterling with a look of awe and deep remorse. He had been ready to answer death with more death. This old man, this Wasi who had lost everything, was answering it with life. It was a lesson that would shape the rest of his years. As night fell, a new kind of silence descended on the Maddox Ranch. It wasn't the heavy, judgmental silence of the morning. It was a peaceful silence, filled with the sounds of quiet work, of healing, of a community being reborn. The first fever broke just after midnight. A small boy, one who had been on the brink of death, opened his eyes and asked for a drink of water. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. Sterling Maddox had done it again. Days turned into a week. No more children died. The sick began to recover. The clean water flowed and life returned to the downstream camps. The townspeople, led by Tom Morrison, did not leave. They stayed, helping to rebuild, bringing food and supplies, offering their labor as a form of apology. Old prejudices, walls that had stood for generations, began to crumble. They saw the Cheyenne not as hostiles, but as neighbors who had been grievously wronged. Fricks was taken away by the marshal, destined for a trial he could not win, and a hangman's noose he richly deserved. His reign of greed was over. On the 8th day, Ayanna found Sterling sitting on his porch, watching the sunset. He looked tired, older than he had a week ago, but his eyes were clear for the first time in 23 years. She stood beside him, and for a long time, they said nothing. "My father was right," she finally said softly. "You are a man who chooses children over himself. Twice now, you have saved us." Sterling shook his head. "You saved me, Ayanna, all of you. You came here and you broke down the door to a prison I didn't even know I was in. You gave me back the truth." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old worn medallion the elder had given him. He held it in his palm. "Your father said the debt would not be forgotten. I think now it is paid." Ayanna placed her hand over his, her strong fingers closing around his in the medallion. "No, Sterling Maddox, a debt of life can never be fully paid. It can only be honored." She looked at him, a warm, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "This is your home, but our home is also your home. The elders have spoken. We would be honored if you would come and live with us. Be our healer. Be our elder. Be what you were always meant to be, a brother." Sterling looked out at the land, his land. But it wasn't just dirt and rock anymore. It was a place of memory, of sorrow, but now of redemption. He looked at Ayanna, at the strong, proud people she led. He thought of his wife, Little Dove, and the promise he had made. He had kept his promise, and in doing so, after 23 years of being lost in the wilderness of his own grief, he had finally found his way home. He had found his family again. The circle was complete. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an incredible tale. Every story we tell is a journey, and your support makes it all possible. And for another unforgettable story where a hidden truth changes everything, click the video on your screen right now. Thanks for watching.